Why younger generations are poorer than their parents and its economic impact. A society grows great when the elderly plant trees whose shade they know they will never sit under. This is a Greek proverb from a time long before the problems of our modern economies or even the study of economics itself. It is as true today as it was thousands of years ago. But are we really living according to this idea? For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, successive generations are not becoming richer than their parents. Dear viewers, if you appreciate the video and want to help us grow, we ask you to consider the idea of subscribing to our channel and making a donation to support us. Your support is essential for us and will allow us to continue creating interesting and useful content for you. You can do it here below, through the appropriate buttons, subscribe, and thanks. While there have certainly been setbacks and historical anomalies to this trend, it has remained largely true for the populations of the most developed economies for a long time. People simply expected that their children would have a better standard of living as adults than they did. But today, that is no longer the expectation. In fact, most young professionals can only aspire to live the lifestyle of their parents. Younger generations are finding it increasingly difficult to find reliable jobs, afford comfortable homes, start a family, and save for retirement, despite the fact that the world today is a much richer place than it was in the past. At any point in the 20th century, when the baby boomers were busy building their now untouchable fortunes, what is happening here? How is it possible that a collectively richer world is producing poorer generations than those that preceded them? Is there an underlying cause for this? If there is there a way to reverse the trend? If not, does it mean that we can only expect each future generation to be poorer than the one before it from now on? Oh, and I suppose it's worth asking, does it even matter, since everyone will die eventually and pass on their wealth anyway? Here's a question for all of you. Is it better to be born into a large cohort with many people of your same age, or into a small cohort with few people of your same age? Traditional economic theory would suggest that a small cohort is preferable, meaning less competition for jobs, housing, social programs, places in good schools, and at a macro level, less competition for basic things like natural resources. But how then do you explain the baby boomers, who, despite being part of the largest demographic explosion ever, are a very wealthy aggregate? Well, Lord David Willetts, a British politician, demographer, and author, suggests that the opposite might actually be true, and that in a democratic system, being part of a larger cohort is actually preferable because it gives that group more voting power on generational issues and more influence in the markets. When the baby boomers were young, they voted for policies that benefited them. Free or low-cost higher education, family support systems, and strong social welfare. When they reached the peak of their careers, their voting patterns changed again. And now this large block of voters was in favor of lower income taxes, less business regulation, more protection for national industries to avoid outsourcing and global competition, and on a smaller scale, things like zoning laws that would protect the value of their homes. The push towards the suburbs with mandatory requirements for single-family homes meant that houses became larger and desirable positions became more sought after because only a limited number of families could have their homes built there. In the 1950s, houses were fundamentally a commodity. Most of the expense was in the construction of the structure itself, and it wasn't unreasonable that the family car cost more than the family home. Fast forward 50 years, and those houses are now investments as much as they are places to live in old age. Baby boomers started voting to support pension subsidies, medical infrastructure, and to remove estate taxes, even if it comes at the expense of all the plans that served them well in their youth. Naturally, David Willetts' work focuses specifically on the United Kingdom, and yes, I know there are certainly people who vote for the greater good rather than the narrow self-interest, but on average, it's easy to see this trend over the last half-century in most advanced economies. In my own home, Australia, for example, the 2019 federal elections were more or less decided by a policy decision that would have reduced the tax effectiveness of Australian pension accounts. The party that supported maintaining the favourable tax structure ended up winning, primarily thanks to older Australian voters. We just had another election where the opposition party backtracked on its plan to change pension account taxes and won very convincingly. A study on the 2017 UK elections found that over time, votes for Conservative parties have shifted from being divided between the rich and the working class to being divided between the young and the old. Much of what I've talked about so far comes directly from Willetts' book, The Pinch, and a lecture he gave at the Royal Institution. It's definitely worth reading if you're interested in these demographic processes. Now, a lifetime of favourable government policies can be enormously helpful in creating wealth. Imagine how much better off the average millennial would be if they had free college or high school, even all else being equal. This would be the difference. Many young people need to be able to put down a deposit on a house, and this is the next big problem to consider, the housing gap. David Willett's small cohort theory probably omits or at least doesn't emphasize an important detail that gave baby boomers another advantage over subsequent generations, and no, it's not simply that they were able to buy houses when they were cheap, although that certainly didn't hurt. It's more a symptom of a bigger problem. They were a large cohort in a small world. They had all the voting power and almost no competition. In the 1950s and 1960s, the world population was about a third of what it is today, and not to start everything from here, but if you were a white man in the countries we're focusing on most, competition was even less severe. So this adds back in all the apparent compromises we thought about before. There was genuinely less competition for practically everything, including jobs, because employers had a smaller range of labor to choose from. Female labor force participation was very low, further reducing the supply, which meant that workers had more bargaining power, but it also meant that domestic work was normally done, which reduced household expenses for things like childcare, food, and general maintenance. These relatively higher incomes, combined with lower expenses, meant that houses could often be paid off with a year's income. Yes, they had to endure higher interest rates, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, which were their peak home buying decades, but it didn't really make the difference it would today. The average price of a house in the United States in 1985 was $82,000. This is the median, so 50% of houses, like the ones first-time homebuyers would look at, would be cheaper than this, but let's keep it simple and stick with $82,000. Adjusted for median family incomes, $82,000 is $3,000 a year. The average mortgage rate at the time was 15%, or about $15,000 a year. It increased in some years, but most mortgages were fixed at an absolute maximum of about 15%, so this is the worst-case scenario. The median house today costs $430,000, and the average interest rate is just over 5%, or $21,500 a year just for interest payments. Again, this is adjusted for the median incomes of the time, so on the surface, they seem fairly comparable. Perhaps younger generations shouldn't complain about the inaccessible cost of housing after all. Many people dismiss this comparison by saying that inflation at the time was extremely high, so these higher interest payments didn't mean anything. But in reality, that's not true. Inflation in 1985 was 3.5%, and although it had reached 13.5% in 1980, this was the Consumer Price Index, not housing inflation. House prices in these decades grew at a relatively modest rate. It was everything else that was becoming expensive. This is a bit the opposite of what we expect today, where housing price growth outpaces inflation, but it wasn't like that in the 1970s and 1980s. So, is it fair to complain about how easy it was for baby boomers to buy a house? Well, no, they still had it easy for two other big reasons that you wouldn't expect, but it's not that. Higher interest rates actually helped them save money for a deposit. A savings account that pays 10% interest a year really accelerates that savings goal. Higher interest rates also ensure that house prices never get too high because the repayments would simply become unsustainable. In our earlier example, we were looking at the interest paid on loans from two different time periods, but the fact with a mortgage is that you also have to repay the principal. Repaying the principal on a $430,000 mortgage with a standard 30-year duration will cost an additional $14,300 a year, bringing the total annual repayment to just under $36,000. The 1985 house would have a principal repayment of $3,000 a year, bringing the total repayment to just over $18,000 a year, half of what the 2022 homebuyer would pay, despite the interest rates being 3 times higher. In other words, if the repayments were kept unchanged, the person who bought the house in 1985 could have paid it off in 5 years instead of 30 years. So why am I focusing so much on housing well-being, even though it's a very important part of our lives? Houses are also particularly unproductive. The real estate sector is, in a sense, unique as a class of activity because it doesn't produce anything of value. A house situated on a plot of land can increase in value, and it can provide a home to its owners or a stream of rental income to an investor, but it doesn't produce anything. Of course, today there are other investments like cryptocurrencies that don't produce anything of value, but their market is small compared to the global real estate market, small and also irrelevant. If the value of Bitcoin reaches $1 million, well, that's fantastic for the people who invest in it, and it will have some small knock-on effects in other markets because people will cash out to buy whatever they buy, millionaire crypto people, but it won't put anyone in a bind. The economic accessibility of housing can, and it can also slow down the progress of entire economies. Every economy in the world is still, for better or worse, concentrated around large centers of economic activity, what a normal person might call a city. If the housing market in these cities becomes too expensive, then it becomes impractical for workers to maintain a job there because more and more of their income will only go to paying rent. In the short term, this can be compensated for by higher wages, but then these centers will only operate to the benefit of the property owners who are fortunate enough to own a property there. It's unlikely that the money property owners earn from their properties will be reinvested in business growth or spent regularly in consumer consumption that keeps these activities going. This activity is likely to be spent on more properties, further increasing market values and the amount of money that is being sucked out of productive centers to be pushed into unproductive activities. Higher house prices also reduce social and geographic mobility. A 2020 Pew Research study found that 52% of young American adults aged 18 to 28 still live at home with their parents. It could also be reasonably supposed that this number is higher after 2 years of lockdowns and record housing price growth. These young adults are financially tied to the place where their parents live. If they are offered a really good job in a different city, they will have to decide whether the salary increase is worth the increase in the cost of living on their own. If they decide no, then they lose a good job, and a company loses a productive worker. The concentration of wealth in a particular generation is something that can have very real consequences for entire economies, and these effects will only increase the more the population ages. Places like Japan are clear examples of this, and they don't have the same kind of housing problems that we have in the West, but in the long term, it does matter. I don't want to get too macabre, but ultimately, people die, and their wealth will be transferred to their children or other beneficiaries, so the concentration of wealth in a single generation is, at worst, a transitory problem. Last year, I made an entire video on the Great Wealth Transfer, which is the process of baby boomers dying and leaving their wealth behind. The problem we discovered in that video is that much of the wealth that is transferred comes in the form of private family businesses. In short, the problem is that these small businesses often need the owner to continue operating, and the people who inherit these businesses are not willing or able to run them. Small businesses are a huge part of the economy. Losing them would cause a lot of damage. Now, a glimmer of hope here is that these businesses can be sold by their heirs to people who have the skills and the will to run them. Perhaps they will sell them to people who have obtained the money necessary to buy the business from their own inheritances. The problem here is the type of people who will actually receive this money. Most people don't receive money from their parents dying until they are quite old, often approaching the end of their careers or starting retirement. If the money is transferred to them, they will probably only use it to finance their retirement and then pass on what's left to their own elderly children. Money that accumulates in the hands of elderly people means that fewer opportunities will be available to young people to do all the things that make a functioning economy work: buy a house, find a good job, and, start a family so that there is a continuous supply of workers to run an economy. You can't run an economy with people who are waiting to become old enough to finally do something with their lives. Economists call this the intergenerational wealth problem. I like to call it the Prince Charles paradox, but it's something we have to address. Things like wealth taxes and inheritance taxes are commonly proposed solutions, but even if they work, they will be very unpopular among the enormous block of voters that brought us here in the first place. The last thing we need to ask ourselves is whether this is all the baby boomers' fault. I know a bit of intergenerational squabbling is all very entertaining, but blaming our current economic problems on a single generation won't be very productive. Voting in your best interest and policies enacted in the best interest of the majority are the foundation of democracy, and I don't think anyone could reasonably argue that this is a bad thing. I also think it's very important to look at examples of economies where this hasn't happened. The second largest economy in the world, China, is a great counterexample. Their baby boomer generation is known locally as the lost generation because they spent most of their working lives in a dysfunctional economic system. They were also too old to truly benefit from the rapid economic expansion that took place in the subsequent decades at the beginning of the opening of the economy. This meant that, despite still representing a large portion of the population, they did not enjoy the same economic prosperity as their Western contemporaries. Economic prosperity was also something that baby boomers enjoyed, and that was not necessarily under their control. The last half of the 20th century, by historical standards, was very peaceful. The world also opened up to international trade, and growth was driven at full speed by an abundance of low-cost energy in the form of fossil fuels. It was a great time to make a fortune, and people did. That's probably the final piece of the puzzle. Once people become extremely rich, and I'm talking about multimillionaires and billionaires, they normally don't become poor again. The group of billionaires that came from this generation will distort these figures to make them look worse than they actually are. Remember, in a group with 1 billionaire and 999 completely broke people, the average member of that group is a millionaire. Most billionaires are quite old, and these people will have a disproportionate impact on their generational wealth statistics. Again, if we look at billionaires by age in China, a country where the vote of the general population doesn't really come into play in the traditional sense, we can clearly see that wealth derived from periods of strong economic conditions, not just from the ability to bend public policies to suit you and yours. In the comments, share your direct experience related to the topic covered today. We want to learn more and will gladly respond to any questions. Comment to let us know how we can improve. Your like would make us happy. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video.